everybody. This is Jackie here with the Sexy Politico, back from my long vacation, and we're here today with Kathleen Stewart. Now, Kathleen runs a political affairs communications firm called the Stewart Collective. She's out of Washington State. Now, Kathleen, could you explain to everybody exactly what the Stewart Collective is before we get started with everything else?
Yeah, definitely. And Jacqueline, thanks so much for having me. As I said, especially it's Labor Day today, and it's great to be on with you and talking about this today.
Awesome.
Stewart Collective is a public affairs and strategic communications firm. We're fully remote. We have team members all over the U.S., and we work with unions, businesses, government agencies, and political action committees, helping them create change through political and communications campaigns.
I mean, in this day and age, you need somebody to at least help you navigate social media and your strategy of communication, because even with local and state and city politics, everything's online now. Am I wrong to think that way?
No, 100%. And a lot of what we end up doing is just rolling up our sleeves and getting the job done with folks. I think especially after the pandemic, everyone is our clients are usually executive directors or communications directors, government affairs folks who do this work, full time, but they're so inundated with the pressure of their current job, the coalitions that are forming, which are new and exciting and take time and relationships. And then, like you mentioned, the flood of social media and PR and reporting up to stakeholders and out to stakeholders. So we really pride ourselves on kind of rolling up our sleeves and being organizers and political staffers at heart and just getting the job done, not being, stuffy suits telling you what the strategy should be. We really like to partner with our clients and get this stuff done.
Absolutely fantastic. I personally have only worked in one political campaign back in 2015. It was a congressional primary in Illinois, and
Awesome.
sadly my candidate didn't win, but it took my life in a different direction. But
did you have a good experience? I mean,
I had a great experience. He was a really nice guy. I learned so much about just like the nitty gritty, like going door to door, getting signatures for petitions. I don't know about politics up there, but in Illinois, it's like a point of pride to have almost double the number of signatures that you need. And it's kind of a dick measuring contest.
Awesome.
Who has the longest, who has the most number of signatures.
Oh my gosh. I love that. Yeah. And
here it seriously is. And then whoever registers first is first on the ballot. It's not alphabetical or anything like that. So your campaign manager is basically sleeping outside the office the night before you can turn everything in.
I love that so much. Up till now, this may change in the next handful of years with campaign finance reform happening here. And I'm based in Oregon, so we're still kind of working on some of the campaign finance stuff here.
Illinois has some weird stuff that's its own thing.
Totally. Yeah. Every state is its own game, but I mean, the campaigns here, we're always like telling people, don't go after the signatures. It takes a lot of effort, but it does get your team up and running a little earlier. So if you're a really well-greased campaign from the start, it can be great. But I think when campaign finance laws start eventually, I can't imagine that won't change, and we'll have funny stories like that to share with you.
Oh my god!
Or we'll be calling for advice.
It's such a measuring contest.
Yes. Oh, totally. Well, that's so fun.
It's like you need 3,500 signatures. Oh, we are going to have 6,500 signatures.
I love that. My favorite story like that, and I don't know that I can top that, but one time Senator Merkley here in Oregon offered to give, it was a match, and then it was a descending, he had like tiers, but it was a match for anyone who got any state legislative candidate that got the most small dollar donations within a period of time. And I was working for, my first candidate in Oregon, and there was one really, really organized. It was a guy who was running for office, but was an organizer. So his team was like great. And our team was really bare bones and really small. But I was like, I really want to win this. When we stayed on the phone for 3 days straight, and we got so many $3 and $1 donations.
Oh,
and
man.
We almost beat the guy who was, everybody knew would win. Yeah, and then
No.
he
Oh,
figured out what we were doing and started making more calls. So
but
we got number two, but it was fun.
learning how to learning how to make those phone calls to ask for
Mhm.
donations and just
Yeah,
having the and having I that was the biggest thing that our campaign manager had to teach the candidate was just to make the ask, because a
right.
lot of people don't want to ask their friends, their family, their former
Yeah.
their college classmates, people who they
Uh-huh.
used to work for that kind of money. And this was, since this
Mhm.
was a federal campaign, he had, of course there's a limit, but it's still just asking, making that ask.
Yeah. Yep. Yep. And having a team who all knows how to make, they're all in. So they're asking their networks and, it kind of moves outward from that. But especially for a brand new candidate, that can be really scary.
Yeah.
You
So
know?
so in this day and age, we want more diverse candidates. I mean, I'm talking about working for working for an older white
Uh-huh.
gentleman. I mean, most of the
Mhm.
candidates that we want more candidates who are
Yeah.
different races, different ethnicities,
Mhm.
different just different backgrounds in general. How can we help with
Yeah.
getting more candidates that are younger, look different, who have different backgrounds, things of that nature?
Yeah. It's such a big question and great to be asking. So thanks for sharing it. And my lived experience, is going to be, what it is. And I think, I always look to leaders who are in this work and coaching candidates of color in particular have that lived experience. So to speak from my perspective, I think there's two pieces of this, right? You mentioned the candidate you worked with, or just two to start. There's many pieces of it, but um, the first one is, like you said, knowledge, right? Like the experience and the knowledge to do something. It takes time to learn that, but not just time. It also takes networks, right? And networks of
Mm-hmm.
people who have done it before, who are willing to be on a phone call with you at 9 o'clock at night, because that's when you finally, as a candidate, have time to ask questions about how you're supposed to call your list and how you're supposed to organize your time and all these like little tiny details that make up a really good candidacy. So the network and the knowledge network is almost how I would say it, having that built. Now, especially for new candidates, right? Women, people of color, BIPOC,
Young.
trans people running, young people running. Yeah. They're not going to necessarily, take like a 22-year-old woman who wants to run, right? Great candidate, all the right ideals, but she's not going to have, she may not have that kind of network around her, that knowledge network right away. And so I think it's incumbent on us, to build the kind of structure that needs to happen for her or for these kinds of candidates, structurally into our makeup as a progressive, kind of wing of the party. We've started to build that, right? But often we've built it in a big way around recruitment and around candidate training. But I think that brings me to my second point, which is on the retention, and then candidate support along the way is where we're really, really lacking. And so the knowledge network and then this retention, once you have people running for office and then in office, we are falling down in such a big way. And I think, you can recruit until you're blue in the face, pun intended there, but if you're not keeping the really smart, wonderful, diverse voices that you've recruited and that have run in the race as feeling like supported and surrounded by this knowledge network,
Mm-hmm.
supported by the right kind of information, but also once they're in office, keeping them, the support system around them, then you lose them, right? And once they're lost, it's really hard to recruit somebody back who had a bad experience in office. And one of the things, I mean, just to speak to, a study that happened here in the Northwest, Oregon Futures Lab, which is a really, really cool organization here in Oregon. They just came out with a study or the result of a whole bunch of conversations with candidates of color and elected leaders of color here in the state. And their findings were really, really interesting. One of them, they had a number of findings, but a couple of them, just to touch on them. One was that participants in their study that they spoke with didn't feel like they were adequately informed when they began their leadership career and then entered into governance. So they really felt like they needed additional training and support in order to understand the political processes and governance systems and coaching around change management, which I thought, again, we can recruit all day long, but if we're not providing the information about here's how the system really works, it's not designed for us, right? It's not designed
No.
for new voices. It wasn't designed by or for us. But how do you teach people how it works so they can then change it? Um, and then a big piece, right, is participants in their study really talked about public safety and mental health for.
Editing Jackie here. Just letting you know that my cat vomited, and so there is a weird edit here.
Yeah, I mean, I think I was kind of touching on that second point, which is around retention, right? We can recruit and recruit and recruit. And I've done a whole lot of recruiting of candidates, particularly women, people of color, younger folks running for office. And I've also helped a lot of those candidates as they've been candidates. And
Right.
probably be the first to tell you that what you can provide on the campaign trail is so limited, right? It's limited and it's lacking. But I think that part's lacking, right? Once someone becomes a candidate, but once someone, they've maybe been trained to be a candidate, they've maybe been recruited by somebody who knows what they're doing. But then when they become a candidate, it's kind of sink or swim.
Yep.
And then once they're in office, there's like literally, there's not even a lifeboat. There's not even a life raft for you once you're a candidate. And I think, for candidates, you probably heard this too, but for folks who aren't, individually wealthy, for folks who've got kids or caregiving responsibilities, none of the systems that are designed around candidates or elected officials are designed for those folks, right? Folks who have any caregiving, they're designed for older white guys.
Yeah, exactly. I'm
Yeah.
38 years old, and I'm
Yeah.
sitting here going, well, maybe I might think about running for city or state office. And then I'm like, yeah, but who the 4-letter word is gonna watch my kids?
Right.
There's
Exactly.
it's part of the reason I don't have full-time work is because
Right.
childcare is expensive.
It's so expensive. So you're already making that decision between work or childcare because the equation doesn't add up. And then a lot of times elected officials in the Northwest, a lot of our elected positions at the state level pay about $30,000 a year. And they've become year-round jobs with staff that report to you and constant responsibilities. So that's been a big thing I've been focusing on here, when I'm talking about things in the Northwest. I mean, that's just one example, but that's all over the United States, right? So
Texas, I think, is one of the worst, where they were designed to be 1 year on and 1 year off. And yet those elected officials are working all the time, even though they're only getting paid as though they're working 1 year on and 1 year off.
Totally. So, okay, so you're already getting paid a really low amount. You're working way more than it was ever intended for that job. Then you've got the mental health load of that role, right? We were talking, I think, before we turned on recording about just what happens for me as a white woman when I go out on a podcast or go on YouTube, and that's pales in comparison to what happens to BIPOC or trans people. It's intense. So the mental health load of that. And then, we're looking at more and more threats being made to elected officials today, right? Which is, there's literally quotes, that study that I was talking about, those quotes from by Oregon Futures Lab. There were quotes in that thing about, I don't want to die for this. It was coming from a school board member. Somebody who ran for just school board and wants to serve their local community on the school board, and they faced death threats, right, to them and their family, because their, addresses out there. So those are the kinds of things that we've got to address systemically if we want to keep people in office.
Absolutely. And it's insane.
Yeah.
It's absolutely insane that somebody wants to be that change to help either locally or federally, but because of this, I wouldn't even call it the anonymity of the internet, when it's really, you're not anonymous anymore, but you feel like you're anonymous. You're scaring the shit out of people.
Yeah, 100%. And for, who's not anonymous, right, is the elected official or the podcast host, right? You're putting your face out there and people can find your home address. It takes a lot, and it takes more money to hide your home address, right? Those kinds of like basic safety things aren't things that are typically covered in government. So you might,
no, my brother runs my website my website is, I think, in Delaware.
Oh yeah, that's awesome. You have this like protection shield.
My little brother is is a smart cookie.
That's fantastic. Oh my gosh, I'm such a fan. And you've been doing this for a long time before it was cool to be podcasting about politics.
So I started my website in 2009, and the podcast only came about in 2020. And that was,
Yeah.
but yeah, I've had the Sexy Politico has been a thing since 2009, although a lot of those old articles have been archived.
Yeah. The tone changes over time.
Tone changes, you realize that you were an idiot.
Yeah. I've had my fair share of those things too. I mean,
Yeah.
isn't that the way of things though, right? Like you learn, I mean, and we have some grace to do that because we're not elected, some grace, right? But
Yeah.
man, it's not easy putting yourself out there talking about politics publicly.
Although it's kind of nice though having your name. If I Google my name,
Yeah.
I get a Chinese ballerina dancer. And if I Google my maiden name, I get an actress from Gunsmoke. So I have some pretty strong Google gangers. So it's a little bit harder
I
to
love
find me.
that. Oh, that's great. Yeah, that really helps.
Yeah.
It's really cool. What made you start it in the first place?
The
your podcast?
website, it was because I didn't have anybody directing me on how to actually get involved in politics. Like I didn't know where to start. And so it was like my uncle was like, just make a website. I'm like,
Interesting.
okay. Like I just didn't know where to start. Like
Yeah.
there isn't, because there's no like there was no bulletin board that just said, help me run
No.
for office. And then
Right.
I had a friend who works in public transportation, and he's like,
Yeah.
you know that there is a job board just for people who want to find political jobs? I'm like,
Yeah.
know that. Thank you for this information.
I love that so much. So you started the website around the same time I went from corporate PR, and then I started working in politics in 20. No, that's you were ahead of me. I was in 2011.
I graduated from undergrad in 2007. I started the
Oh, yeah.
website at the end of 2009.
That's awesome. So you were ready. Yeah, back then it was kind of cool because Obama was around, but it wasn't like
Exactly.
red
Obama
hot
was
like it
there.
got.
Yeah.
Yeah. That's really cool. How long have you had the podcast? I should know
Since the end of 2020.
Okay. Yeah.
Yeah.
That's awesome. Have you
Yeah, I was
enjoyed
one
having
of the
a
many
podcast?
people to start a podcast in 2020.
Yeah. Well, what else were you gonna do? Everybody just sitting around
Exactly.
baking bread and watching their kids.
Oh gosh.
Like I said, I started a
I
training
mean,
school in
potty
2020.
training was, a big part of my 2020,
Yeah.
but
Same. Brutal in 2020. My carpets will never be the same. We just had to replace the damn things.
yeah. So if we get back into politics a little bit here, we know running for office costs money, no matter
Yes.
what you run for. Is there a
Yeah.
way that we can make running for office more affordable so that younger people can get involved that aren't independently wealthy?
Yeah. So I'm not an expert in campaign finance. I've always run campaigns in the state, primarily in the state of Oregon, where people have liked to say, and I think it's going out of style now because of how ridiculous it is, that what we don't have in campaign finance limits, we make up for in transparency, which I think has its challenges. So what that means is that the campaigns I've worked on have had no limits. They've just been like free for all, throw money. Yeah. And then our legislative races here have, like I said, no limit, and they're really competitive because people, it's kind of, you can just dive in, there's no limits, things just go, they get really big, really fast. So our races here, a targeted legislative race, a House or Senate race is like a small congressional somewhere else. So you're looking at like 1.2 to 1.5 million on each side. Sometimes, usually around $1 million.
That's insane.
Yes, it's
That's
insane.
absolutely insane. The guy I worked for in Illinois, it was like $500,000 for a federal congressional House seat.
Right, which is still an enormous amount of
It's
money.
a,
Like
it
I
is an enormous amount of money, but comparatively, I mean, he was running for federal office.
Right, right. I know. So I'm kind of laughing, but it's like it's not very funny. It's
But
just it's gross.
it's not funny in general. I mean, you can run for federal
Yeah,
office. I mean, it's just you can
yeah,
run for federal office at like 25 years old. But what
right.
25-year-old can afford it unless you have
No.
big donors behind you.
Well, exactly. And so, in Oregon anyway, they're looking at a whole host of campaign finance laws. So that'll be coming. And I think in most states, they've started to look for ways to do that differently. But I think, the question around, how do you get candidates we want to run for office, just run, right? Sign up and run and then win. I think you were talking earlier about the question of kind of information early on, like it was hard for you to know how to get involved. I think the same standards, the same issues apply to great candidates, right? And I think um, just helping candidates understand what they're signing up for and how it works is a really big start, beyond the money stuff, because even the most wealthy candidates, well, there's some super wealthy candidates who are going to self-fund, but even those candidates are going to go out and look for money, right? So like what does money in politics bring you? I mean, usually money in politics equals two things. I think viability is one,
Yes.
and the second is connections, right?
I mean, that's why Trump wanted to self-finance his entire presidential campaign. And the Republican
Right.
Party told him he needs to look for money because he needs
Yeah.
those connections and he needs to prove to the rest of the Republican base that he can make those connections. While he's
Yeah.
not my favorite president, that the Republican Party itself knew that they needed those connections.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. And I think, when you look even just one step lower, like than the presidency, right? Because that's just this whole
Oh,
separate ballgame.
yeah.
But Congress all the way down, to local dog catcher. I mean, the first thing you want to be doing, I think, to help those candidates is helping them understand that, showing that they have the ability to be a viable candidate, right? Put in the hours, put in the effort, show how much you want it. Getting training really helps, asking for mentors, reading books. I mean, that all seems really basic, but that's just like anything, right? If you want to be a great manager or a great parent or a great friend, you lean into it and you learn and you ask people about it and you think about it and you prepare for it, right? I've recruited a lot of candidates, and the very best candidates had almost always been talking with their communities 1 to 2 years prior to thinking about running, or been thinking about it, right? They've been kind of ruminating about it. And when they were finally reached by a recruiter, it wasn't like, I've never heard of that idea before. It was like, yeah, I've been thinking about this, right? Or I've been kind of in talks with people, not to say you can't go from 0 to 100, but, and you should, I hope no one hears this and is dissuaded, because if you're not thinking about it and you want to run next cycle, you should go for it for sure. That's a great way to dive in. But those are the candidates. Like if you're doing your homework and leaning in and asking questions, you're going to be in a better place. And then my least favorite candidates that I've recruited by far, this is just a good white guy story. One time I was recruiting for a local DA position for a district attorney to run, and it was a pretty prominent role
Yeah.
in this community. And someone who I called, he has no experience, right? He's a lawyer, just never run for office, never elected to anything, which I knew because I'd done some basic research, but I thought it'd be a good fit. And he says, "Oh no, I don't want to run for that. Call me when you're recruiting for Congress." And I'm thinking, very few calls are made when you're recruiting for Congress. You make a few calls, and the calls that you do make are the people who have been doing all the other jobs before it, right? So just like that, if you want to be a candidate, right, build relationships, get started at the minimum and work your way up. You're not always
It's
going to dive in to run for Congress first thing.
it's like the person I worked for was a state senator before running for
Yeah.
Congress. He wasn't like, "Hey, what's up?"
Right. And
He had
you know,
name
that's
recognition in the county.
totally, but he also had connections and viability because people
With
have seen him run.
with all of the unions, which in Illinois, if you don't have union connection, you're screwed.
Yeah, exactly. And so, he may or may not have been an individually wealthy person, but, taking time to build the connections, just the relationships, right? Meeting he probably met tons of frontline workers and unions to represent them. And you know, like sometimes people often dive in like, I'm gonna run for office, I need to know, you know, I need to know everything off the bat. But really good elected leaders and really good candidates ask lots of questions, right? They're just seeking to understand and learn. So I would, you know, I think it can be really, it is really discouraging when you look at how much money is in politics, but I think more encouraging is the way that politics works around relationships, that I think anyone can build relationships, you know, if they're leaning into it and really working at building those.
Honestly, I would love to continue this conversation later. But we're hitting really close to my kids' bedtime.
Okay. Oh, let's go fast. Okay, we'll finish up.
But so what I would like, is there anything that you would like to share with my audience before we have to wrap everything up?
No, you know, not necessarily. I really appreciate you having me on. Like I said,
and I would love to have you on again,
Yeah.
maybe even in a couple of months, so that we could talk
Okay.
about the election cycle as it's unfolding, because it's gonna be something. It's gonna be something.
100%. It's such a big cycle, and I just really appreciate you know, talking with folks and getting us all thinking about what's coming up here, because it's going to be a big cycle and never more important.
Oh yeah, especially when oh God, it's gonna be something. And I think we'll both have stories to share.
I know. No, I'd be happy to be on any time, and I really want to hear more about your primary, that experience.
Oh, I will. Yeah, I can. Yeah, I don't want to burn any bridges over there. So if I share more stories, I'll share it to you off the internet.
Okay. That sounds great. It was great to meet you, Jacqueline.
It was really nice to meet you, and thank you as my sign off goes, thank you for listening to the Sexy Politico. We'll see you all next week. Bye.
Bye.